Okay, so as promised, welcome to the first video of the Rate My Tune series. As the first contender or first participant, we have a VW Beetle. I have a few photos of the engine build and I also have the tune right here. We unfortunately don't have a log, but I'm pretty sure we can see everything from the tune. I'm gonna show you some pictures first. It's actually a pretty cool setup because it was originally an air-cooled engine, is now a 2-liter, so stroked and bored, or rather, I don't know if you can say bored on a air-cooled engine as you replace the cylinders, but with a 74mm stroke and 92mm bore, so it's quite an undersquare engine, so it should be pretty rev happy. Although what I'm kind of concerned about, or I don't know if that's normal for air-cooled engines, maybe you have more info about that, only a 8.8 to 1 compression ratio, which is considered quite low for the, well, basically normal world. On a pretty performance-oriented turbo engine, you would also be running 8.8 to 1, and on a NA application that is high performance, you would rather or run more at the end of 11.5 to 12.5 to 1 or something like that. So this may be a bit low, but yeah. So we have some engine specs right here. So we have a 280-degree cam, so that might be relatively aggressive compared to a stock cam. We have obviously kind of a built head, bigger valves as far as I can see, and 3-angled valve seats, so that would be also beneficial for flow. Bronze valve guides, yeah, that's kind of pretty typical. A forged crank, as I said, 74mm crank forged, that's pretty cool. So it will probably be a lot lighter than a stock crank, a lightweight flywheel, so, and basically some other stuff that is pretty good as it is relatively speaking a built engine to an NA spec. So we have I-beam rods, we have forged pistons, we have, as I said, cams, and we have some other stuff that is pretty cool here. So we can see that this is pretty much an NA engine that I'm not really that sure how much these engines are going to make at that capacity and that compression ratio, but I would guess that's gonna be around like 100 to 120 crank horsepower or something like that, I would assume. Looking at the other photos we have, these are just some photos of the EFI conversion. So there is basically a Speeduino ECU, and together with that I have a picture of the whole setup. Basically this is the ECU, it's basically a Speeduino ECU, and this is the whole setup for the EFI conversion, as normally a Beetle obviously is not electronically fuel injected, has also a very old spark setup. So this is also using a 4-plug coil, or a coil that has 4 spark leads going off of it. So it is probably a single fire coil, but still better than the distributor setup that it was running beforehand. We have also a 36-1 trigger wheel, which is pretty typical, and we can see 2 fuel rails with some injectors. So it's basically EFI converted. Otherwise, obviously, you wouldn't use a Speeduino ECU. Here we can see the intake manifold with the injectors on the other side and open filters. So, and that's basically the engine. Then we'll have a look at the tune. We will go through every step or every single point in the tune just to check everything. So we will go from settings to tuning to spark to startup and accessories, and we will see what is important. On settings, we have the engine constants, which is pretty much set to whatever you need to for the engine. So we have rec fuel that pretty much is the injectors or the injector calculation. I'm not exactly sure which injectors are in this kit, so I am guessing that these are the correct values. Everything else, map, so the ECU is using a map signal to control fueling, which could be done either way, so either via map or via TPS. Could be the same thing if that kit has a TPS, obviously. If it doesn't, obviously you would have to use map. Yeah, everything else is just as usual. There's nothing really too specific. We have 4 injectors, obviously. There are some EFI conversions where you could also use just 1 injector. That would be a really big injector, for example a center injector, but that's not the case in this application. Stoichiometric ratio is wrong in this case. I don't know why it is 14.1 to 1, because usually on gasoline it's 14.7 to 1. So that's one thing that might have to be changed. Injector layout, depending on how they are wired up, semi-sequential, but I'm guessing it's already correct because the car is running. Map sample method, event average is not my favorite thing to use, although there is something at the bottom here where you can make that better. So if there are issues with throttle response, maybe not really, the throttle not really reacting that great, and hesitations when you try to accelerate or try to give it some gas at lower RPMs, then setting the map sample switch point to something like 2500 to 3000 RPM, this will put the map sample method below that RPM to instantaneous, and the car will have much better throttle response. Setting that to instantaneous in general, though, is not really a good idea on an NA car, because the map values you will be getting are lower or are more flaky or are gonna fluctuate more due to this being not averaged out, but being the current value in the intake manifold. So I would set this to, for example, 2500 RPM, and below that it would be instantaneous, and above that cycle average. Injector characteristics, injector duty limit 90%, that's okay. You don't want to really go over that, because a injector opening 100% all the time, while it is possible, it's not really too good for the injector. It can happen that they hang open or whatever. And yeah, the injector open time is the time it takes to open. I have already discussed that in the first few parts of my tuning guide, and I'm guessing that the values here that have to do with the voltage are set correctly to the injector dead times that are provided with the kit. Going to trigger setup, this is obviously going to be different with every trigger setup that you have or that is used. In this case, a 36-1 trigger wheel, which I already guessed correctly in the pictures. The trigger angle is determined with a timing light, so you have to use a timing light to determine the trigger angle. Skip revolutions, this is best set to 1. If it is set to 2 or 3, the car will crank longer before it starts to fire. Setting this to 0 to get the car started faster isn't really practical, as it will still sometimes take a full rotation to get it started. So sometimes it will take the same amount of time as it would with 1, but with 1 it will be more consistent in time from starting to crank to actually starting. Trigger edge and secondary trigger edge is probably fine. If the car is running, then this is going to be correct. Trigger filter, if there are no issues with any sync loss, set this to the weakest you can, although medium in most cases is okay. I just wouldn't really recommend aggressive if you can avoid it. IAT density, well, that really is generally pretty similar for all engines, as it is just the oxygen content of the air depending on the intake air temperature. And same goes for barometric correction. That is just the correction for the height. Basically, if you go higher up, so if you are in the mountains, the oxygen in the air is going to be less than in like at sea level. Going to tuning, we have acceleration enrichment. This can be something where you try to correct the throttle response if you have not selected a map sample switching point and you feel like the throttle response is kind of bad. Then rather than to mess with acceleration enrichment, mess with or put in 2500 or so in here, and it will be already much better. And then you can mess with acceleration enrichment. Most of the time, the stock curve that is given here is kind of okay. You will have to look if you are, for example, on individual throttle bodies, like on this application. You will have to look if you will put your foot on the gas fast, then it will onto what it will actually jump, and then you will put in these values here. So that is basically how much percent the throttle body opens per second. So this could be like 500% per second. If you, for example, open the throttle body from 0 to 100% within 0.2 seconds. And if the throttle response is now good, I would just leave it at that and not really adjust it. We have some things down here. The TPS.threshold percent is the threshold from when on the acceleration enrichment will actually take place. So if we have 70 in here, then it will only open or only start at 70 TPS dot. So these 20 here will probably never even take place. I would take this down rather to like 30 or 20 if you still have some hesitation when you put your foot on the gas relatively slowly from a standstill or from driving. Then we have the time it will actually enrich the mixture, so 200 milliseconds or 0.2 seconds. That is fine most of the time. And taper start is when it is going to start tapering off the curve from here. So for example, at 2500 it will still enrich the mixture 65%, but at 4000 RPM, if you do the same, it will not enrich it anymore. So this is the curve when it will stop to enrich, because on a higher RPM you don't really need the acceleration enrichment anymore, because there is enough fuel in the intake manifold to wet the cylinder walls and to not have that hesitation. Cold adjustment is also pretty important. If you are starting your engine cold, it will have probably worse throttle response, and therefore you might need to add some fuel in here. You will have to try around with that when the engine is cold. Cold adjustment taper start temperature. This is the temperature from when it will start to go to the normal values, and this is the temperature when it will reach that normal table. Deceleration fuel cutoff is highly recommended to put it on because that will save you a lot of fuel if you are in the deceleration. So if you are in gear and off throttle, then this feature will cut your fuel depending on a few parameters. For example, if you are under 1% TPS, if you are under over 1500 RPM, or with a certain delay. While yes, if you want pops and bangs, you can leave this off or put in a delay and then adjust time and fuel accordingly. For fuel saving, I would leave this or put this on because yeah, it just saves a bunch of fuel, for example, when daily driving. AFR O2, this is already set to wideband and PID algorithm. I really like the PID algorithm here, though I would always, if the algorithm works, so if you have seen that it reaches the correct lambda value while driving, I would always say put the controller authority to 15% or something, because especially if you run on map and have a lot of hills or mountains and you drive there a lot, it will actually be able to adjust the mixture much better for the higher altitude than it would with just 5, for example, because the maximum KPL value you are going to be reaching is lower, then you are at sea level, and therefore your VE value is also going to be lower, and therefore I would give the controller much more ability to correct the fuel for that. I would also set the RPM to like 500 so that it can also correct at idle. Again, this is only given when the car or when the control is actually working. So if you see that the AFR is fluctuating a lot, then you might need to play around with the PID values here and get that dialed in first before you modify any parameters here to get it active all the time. I would also, if it works, put in 100% TPS right here so that it is also active when you are running full throttle. My tip for the PID controls, I like to put in a bit more at the derivative because that smooths kind of out or slows down the fluctuation in the controller and lower that value. So I would put in 60 here and for example 30 here and try that out. If that is better, maybe try around with other values. I will link in the description an explanation for PID because that can be pretty handy if you want to know how it works exactly. Going down to engine protection, this is basically just some rev limiters. Common engine protection is, depending on what you select, how the rev limiters are going to cut. If you have, for example, boost limit set, oil pressure protection set, or coolant temperature protection set, but this is not enabled yet. And here we have the rev limiters. It seems like the engine is only revving to 5500 RPM, given the 74mm stroke and 92mm bore. I would reckon that this engine would probably be able to run like 7500 to 8000 RPM. But I don't know how bad or how good the harmonics of a VW Beetle engine are, so I'm not an expert in this on how high you should set your rev limiter. Boost cut, we don't really need that. Oil pressure, we have it disabled. I don't know if there's a sensor for oil pressure. AFR protection is also not really something I like to use, so I always leave that off because I have a lambda gauge or AFR gauge and I look at that pretty much constantly, or not constantly, but a lot of times, and see if my mixture is kind of in the ballpark. VE table, this is pretty important. As I said, in most applications you will see around 90 to 100 on max load, and in theory around 50 in the idle cells and a bit more in the driving cells. I have not seen a log yet, so I cannot say if or how good this actually works, because it seems like on here, like in the middle, it's kind of relatively low, while in idle it may also be kind of low, but this is a relatively low efficiency engine, so that might be correct. So if it's running at the desired AFRs, it's probably going to be fine. Although I would recommend you touch it with auto-tune on the hard mode as I described in my auto-tune video. Looking at the spark table, there's a bit of potential I can give here. While if no dead cans are used to get the maximum timing that can be achieved, 30 degrees is kind of a good starting point, while I would guess that this engine can do a lot more probably, given the low compression and the relatively old school design of the head. So I would figure that it's going to be about 34 degrees here, tapering down to like 30 to 28 degrees here, because as you go higher in RPM, the combustion is going to take place faster, and therefore you can start the ignition earlier. And then I would maybe put in some more ignition, like 2 to 3 degrees, and taper that to the 22 here in the lower RPMs. This also doesn't make much sense. It doesn't make sense to put in 10 here. I would actually use that 16 and just use that to put in 21 here, so that it's a smooth transition. Otherwise you will have some hesitation, or it will feel like the car is bogging here, while it actually shouldn't. Going to the part throttle, there is also a lot more ignition timing that can be used here. So I would recommend going about even +5. If you would say the 30 are your maximum timing, I would go like to 37 and smooth that out. And again, smooth that out so that it's actually looking somewhat like this. Obviously, if you went higher, or if there was more potential within here and like 34 degrees or something, then obviously you could go even higher here. That will reduce fuel consumption while part throttle somewhat. And same thing is here. I would also smooth that out to get a smooth curve here. Again, as I said in my other videos, this should look as smooth as possible. And when that is smooth and the VE table is smooth, the engine should also drive relatively smoothly. On AFRs, that pretty much looks pretty good. I would recommend that you go a bit leaner right here. So in part throttle, you can go to 14.5 to 15. So you would save some fuel, and you do not have to go to 11.5 on full throttle. It is enough to go to 12 or 12 to 5, depending on what the engine likes. But then you would need a dyno to find out what makes the most power. But a general rule of thumb can be said that 11.5 is good for a turbo car, and 12.5, for example, is pretty good for an NA car. And then again, just I would smooth that out here just to get a smooth transition of the target AFR, so that the lambda control also has a easier time to correct from one cell to the other if need be. Going to spark settings. Okay, those are apparently, this is a cop coil on plug setup, which is kind of weird because I only saw one ignition coil, but if the car runs like this, leave it like that and it should work. Spark output triggers going low should be fine, as it is with most engines. Enable fixed lock timing is off, that's good. And new ignition mode, if it works like this, just leave it off. Dwell settings, depending on the coil, I don't know what the coil likes exactly, but these settings look pretty good for me. These are the same coils ran with, for example, my Audi coils, so I don't see any reason why it shouldn't work here. The dwell should just be not too high. INT ignition retard is also fine. Cold advance, okay, there is no cold advance. And going to startup and idle. This is kind of weird. So usually you would put in about, normally that line should go something like this. Usually at a warmed up engine should be around 120 or so %, or 120 to maybe 150 in extreme scenarios. So 250% fueling while starting a hot engine is kind of a lot. There is risk of fouling the plugs when using that much fuel, and then you would just taper off the others, like put in 200 there and maybe 250 there, so that you have a nice curve. But 250 at a hot engine is pretty much quite a lot. Yeah, these settings are pretty much fine, although I don't know how fast the engine cranks. 500 might be a bit high, so if the engine has a hard time starting that, maybe set that to 400. Priming pulse width, so the pulse width the injectors are opening, or the time the injectors are opening when the engine, before the engine starts, that's also a bit high. I would recommend like 14 maybe here, or maybe 20 at -4 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 20, 12, 8 and 4. It doesn't need that much fuel usually to get the engine started, even if it's a low compression or low efficiency engine. Warm-up enrichment though looks good. That can be left like that. After start enrichment, yeah, that's also pretty good. There's no reason to change that. Idle control, okay, there is no idle control. I don't know if there's an idle valve or whatever. therefore you are using, or idle advance is used. That also looks pretty good. So idle advance is pretty much when the engine has a target RPM it is supposed to reach, that we have here on the right side. The engine is looking at that table over here and is looking at how much the difference is to that target RPM. For example, if it is 50 RPM above it, 150 RPM above it, or 300 RPM above it, it is going to reduce the timing by 2, 3, or 5 degrees. And the other way around, if it is missing 50 RPM, 150 RPM, or 300 RPM, it is going to add 2, 3, or 5 degrees of timing. You obviously can experiment around with those values if they are not reaching the desired values you want to, but otherwise this looks pretty good. And these settings also look pretty good if that works for this engine right now. That's it for the startup and idle. Good. Okay. Thermal fan is probably not going to be the case because, well, this is an air-cooled engine and there is no water temperature sensor. Launch control is not set up. Fuel pump is, prime duration is fine, 2 seconds. That should be enough to get fuel in the fuel rail, and everything else should be also fine. Yeah, that's basically it for this map. I hope you like it. I hope you learned something from it. Otherwise, if you want to take part in this series, just let me know on Instagram or wherever. You can also write a comment down below if, for example, don't have Instagram, and let me know that you want to take part. And as always, I wish you a nice day and goodbye.